thanks very much, Sally, for inviting me, and thanks to Catherine for doing all of the logistical work in setting this up. My talk, as Sally mentioned, is entitled Reproducing the Nation, Maternal Subjects in Cuba. And just to begin, I'm going to talk about the 3 reasons why I'm really privileged to be here and happy to discuss my research with you today. As Sally mentioned, I just published a book entitled Maternal Transition and North-South Politics of Pregnancy and Childbirth. And in this book, I do a comparison or a study of 4 countries, Canada, the United States, Honduras, and Cuba, and I realize I haven't had a chance or haven't taken the opportunity for whatever reason to talk about the research in the Cuban site. I'm not sure why that is, but this is a perfect opportunity to do that, so I haven't discussed that, not in the form that it appears in the book, in the chapter. I'm also really happy about the chance to discuss this with you today because I'm particularly proud, I guess I could say, of this particular piece of research. I've been conducting research on and in Cuba for about the last 10 years. And for various reasons, I think I put up here, Cuba is a challenging research environment. I think I initially had hostile, but I thought, no, that sounds too negative. So it's very challenging, and I feel like a lot of my research efforts over the past 10 years have been compromised, or I had to compromise in a variety of ways, and perhaps I could say more about that, sort of the methodological challenges of doing research in a country like Cuba. But in this research that I'm going to present now, today, I feel as though I was able to do exactly what I had intended to do, and I think that on its own is quite an accomplishment, at least for me. I'm also hoping to, and happy to have the opportunity to continue the conversation that began last month in the first IDEV talk, and I'm referring here to a talk given by Stephen Hennigan on the various constructions of post-revolutionary national identity in Nicaragua. So it'll be a very different kind of discussion of national identity and nationalism, or the idea of the nation, but I think that it builds on that, so I'm pleased to be here for all of those reasons. Oh, I tried to get rid of that little thing, sorry. Okay. What I hope to achieve in this talk is the following. I hope to impress upon you that the idea of the nation in the case of Cuba is replicated and reproduced through decisions made by women on an individual and collective basis. So the sorts of decisions that women make in Cuba about their own maternal health, to the extent that they do have decisions to make, reflect various dimensions of individual identity, collective national identity, as well as various dimensions of things like inequality. I hope also to demonstrate that the nation is a generative metaphor for individual identity as well as a collective understanding of one's place in the world. And so to begin, before I get into the thick of the discussion of the research that was done and some of the excerpts from the transcripts from the interviews, I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of the Cuban nation. So what is the idea of the Cuban nation? Where do we look to for clues? Well, if you've ever been to Cuba, you know you don't have to look very far for examples of nationalism, and the propaganda is everywhere. This is an excerpt from a speech given by Fidel Castro in 1971. He gave this to a federation of Chilean women, and he said, among other things, he said the following: in our country, and of course he said this in Spanish, this is my translation, most women gave birth at home, talking about prior to the revolution of 1959, without help. Many of them died or suffered, or their children died, or suffered infections and other problems. Today, almost 100% of women will give birth in hospital with maximum safety for them and their children. And I mention this now not just to point out that this is one of the revolutionary commitments, and it does continue to generate a lot of national pride, But I think it's safe to say that most Cuban women, maybe most Cubans, bought into this idea that before the revolution, things were bad, women suffered and died at home in fairly high numbers, and after, things improved significantly. This is something that women bought into at the time in 1971, and it's something that they continue to buy into today. They continue to accept this as a foundational element of national identity. And I'll be returning to this idea throughout the talk. This says, I'll read it as soon as I'm still trying to catch my breath. This is, of course, the image of Che, and this is in front. Apparently, I should say that all of the images that I've used, or I don't use images from my own research. There are obviously ethical problems in any case using photos of your own research sites or research participants, especially in the case of Cuba. So these have just been taken from the Google images. But this is a very typical scene in front of a Cuban hospital or polyclinic. And the image says, "Vale más la vida de un ser humano que todo el oro del hombre más rico del mundo." And what it says in English is that the life of one human being is worth more than all of the gold of the richest man in the world. And this expression, it appears throughout Cuba, everywhere, on billboards, in public buildings, on the sides of fences and so on, expresses that human values such as compassion and caring are more important than individual gain. And then I mention this not just because it's very popular Cuban propaganda, but that this is something that has been internalized and is an important aspect of most Cuban identity. It also indicates that there is an importance to sharing the benefits and burdens of difficult economic circumstances, of living in a relatively poor country, and also that it's better for all to have basic rights to maternal survival than for a few to have access to advanced services and others not access to very much at all. So that connects with the quote by Fidel Castro that I just showed you. So throughout my talk, I'm going to demonstrate that the maternal health system in Cuba is coercive. There really are no options. I talked about preferences and decisions as I was introducing the topic. There really aren't any preferences to be expressed or decisions to be made. So it's a coercive health system. But what I'm hoping to show you is that there's a lot more complexity than just this. So we're going to see evidence of a hegemonic system. We'll see that the women certainly aren't resistors, but I'd like to connect this to, and I'll return to it as well, this Abel and Browner quote, that not all forms of resistance advance women's interests. So I think that sometimes as feminist researchers, we're looking for evidence that women are resisting things that we think might not be good for them, resisting the lack of choice in difficult circumstances and so on. So we're not going to see evidence necessarily of political resistance, but I also want to communicate that these aren't socialist dupes either. So to believe in the rhetoric that I've just showed you, and that is everywhere in the country, the images of Che and the words of Fidel, to have that as an internalized part of your identity also doesn't mean you're just blindly following the rules and trying to function in the system and have no ability to question anything. So I will get to this second quote here, which I think fits and speaks to my second point, that despite the common assumption that women inevitably accept authoritative knowledge, even when it contradicts their own experiences, women tend to integrate medical authoritative knowledge with their own experiential knowledge, and thus are only selectively compliant with medical and other forms of authority. So, in this site of the research, and certainly in comparison to the other research sites that are included in my larger project, the preferences of Cuban women concerning care during pregnancy and childbirth are intriguingly uncomplicated. Virtually all women want the highest standard of medical care available. Home birth or midwifery care is neither desired nor romanticized. There is little sentimentality over pregnancy and childbirth, in that women seem not to invest emotionally in matters concerning the transition to motherhood, the crossing of the birth threshold itself. The case of Cuba, then, seems to confirm perfectly the hypothesis that drove the research for my book, which is that marginalized women, in this case women in a relatively poor country, tend to be the least critical of medical intervention in pregnancy and childbirth. What's interesting about the case of Cuba are the reasons why women do not resist medicalization, given the degree to which the state enforces medical authority and the state of those services, which by most reports are not all that good. They continue to generate good outcomes, excellent health indicators, but there are definitely some quality issues. Hospital birth attended by medical doctors is compulsory for all Cuban women, no exceptions, but women are fully supportive of systemic medical regulation. In fact, they tend to be critical of the ways in which promises for medical care are not fulfilled. Also interesting are the political critiques expressed in the narratives that overwhelmingly support the mandatory medical model of health care. Cuba is a developing country in the Latin Caribbean, according to the Pan American Health Organization's taxonomy. Its GDP has roughly doubled since the year 2000, which accounts for, in part anyway, for its classification as a middle-income country. Since the revolution in 1959, Cuba has experienced high levels of absolute poverty, but relatively low levels of relative poverty, the latter due to the state's commitment to a socialist economic model, which includes the broad distribution of social goods, such as healthcare and education. However, in recent years, this economic growth, coupled with growing income inequality, has changed these dynamics. Throughout the revolutionary period until present, Cuba has consistently achieved health indicators that are closer to those of developed nations than to their developing country counterparts. For example, its infant mortality rate is 4.5 per 1,000 live births, much lower than the regional average of 18.1 for the Latin Caribbean, and notably lower than that of the United States, a huge source of national pride for Cuba, of course. The U.S. Infant mortality rate is 6.6, Cuba is 4.5. You see the same kind of pattern in life expectancy. Such success in the field of health is a great practical benefit to the population, as well as an important symbol of Cuban nationalism. The Cuban state and individual Cubans derive a great deal of national pride from the country's ability to maintain high levels of health, education, and gender equality in the face of serious economic and political obstacles. Prior to the triumph of the revolution in 1959, maternal mortality rates were 145 per 100,000 live births. Health services were not nationalized but fragmented along socioeconomic and urban-rural divisions. Much of the rural population relied on midwives, comadronas, for support with pregnancy and childbirth, whereas access to hospitals and medical staff were restricted to those who were able to pay and or reach the urban facilities. Interesting to note as well, in Cuba, midwives are referred to as comadronas commonly, which is a much more antiquated term than parteras, which is the term that's generally used for midwives throughout Central America. By 1975, the maternal mortality ratio had fallen to 68.4, largely as a result of a rural health program whereby health brigades went into communities to provide care to rural and remote populations, in addition to a nationalized health service that provided medical care to all citizens free of charge. In 2011, the maternal mortality ratio was 43.1 per 100,000 live births. And I'm just going to say a little bit about this indicator. it's important to examine that in the context of some of the indicators just mentioned. But Cuba's maternal mortality ratio at 43.1 is directly related to maternal health and maternal outcomes, which is the focus of my research. And by way of comparison, the maternal mortality ratio in the United States is 21, a rate that has doubled since 1990. And when this is disaggregated according to race, there's a very different picture. African American women have rates about 3 to 4 times as high as white women in the United States. In Canada, the maternal mortality ratio is 12, which has also doubled since about 1990. Ireland has the lowest maternal mortality ratio in the world at 1 per 100,000 live births. The Latin American average is 130. For the Latin Caribbean, it is 230. Africa has the highest rates of maternal mortality. Sierra Leone is about 2,100 per 100,000 live births. In Africa, the MMR for the continent is about 900. So Cuba is doing fairly well, not as well as Canada and the United States. So, I didn't mean to go there yet. That's okay. At present, all pregnant women are required to receive prenatal care and deliver their babies in regional maternity hospitals. Births are attended by medical doctors. Women cannot choose their health provider or location of the birth. Women living in rural or remote areas who present with any sort of complication or risk during pregnancy may be required to live in a maternal care unit during the final stages of pregnancy or longer, depending on the associated risk. In addition, women and their families are responsible for most of the supplies that they will need while they're in the hospital, including buckets for water and electric devices to heat the water, towels, blankets, bed linens, nightgowns, and everything that the baby will need. Women who birth vaginally are not offered pain medication. There are no epidurals and no narcotics, although women may bring with them any over-the-counter pain medication that they can acquire. Yet, despite the unapologetic state medical control exercised over pregnancy and childbirth, there is little resistance to the model, and moreover, women demonstrate a considerable amount of agency and analysis through their apparent compliance. As Abel and Browner remind, not all forms of resistance advance women's interests. In this instance, resistance in the form of criticism or proposed alternatives could be interpreted as political dissent for which there can be negative consequences. But compliance, in my view, likely signifies more than simple fear of political reprisals. It reveals a deeper understanding of the practical benefits of medical regulation of pregnancy and childbirth in the context of a developing country, in addition to the ability to separate the positive and negative elements of hegemonic state authority. The research for this site was conducted between March and August 2010 in 2 separate regions of the country and included both rural and urban women. Because of the risks associated with face-to-face recorded interviews, which was the mechanism used in the other research sites, participants were given a series of questions about their birth experiences, what the reality is, what they think the ideal ought to be, and asked to write out their own answers. Their handwritten narratives did not include any identifying information. The narratives themselves were not as extensive as were those collected in other research sites, but did include a considerable amount of reflective analysis, some of it justifying the existing system and some criticizing it. The Cuban research site generated 27 narratives, mainly from women who had had their last child within the past 5 years. The interview questions were distributed and collected by 2 research assistants who were also responsible for recruiting the participants. The written narratives were then typed and analyzed for discursive themes and patterns. As predicted, most of the Cuban women who participated expressed full support for a medical system of maternal health care. Cuban women seem to accept that the medical system created by the state is a benefit that their Latin American counterparts do not possess. Their acceptance of a non-negotiable medical approach to pregnancy and childbirth reflects affirmation of nationalistic goals in healthcare, as well as the inviolability of human rights. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes here where women have referred to human rights or maternal health services as human rights. And I think it's worth mentioning that Human rights weren't mentioned in any of the other research sites in over 250 interviews. So this is, I would say, of some importance to the Cuban women. For example, participant CC13, so CC is one of the research sites within Cuba and DC is the other, and then the number is just the name of the number of the participant. CC13 and CC15 explicitly defend medical care as a human right. One says, we have the right to be attended in a hospital by qualified personnel, and all of us are treated in the same way, free of charge. All women have the right to a single service which our country brings us free of charge. In CC15, it reinforces, that was CC15, sorry. It reinforces Cubans' sense of national pride, as it is evidence that one element of underdevelopment, poor health and unequal access to services, at least, has been abolished. While the narratives do not reveal differences in system-level preferences, they do demonstrate that women are able to access services in different ways, depending on their ability to pay for extra services or gifts for the doctor or proximity to the capital city where additional resources are available, such as things like in vitro fertilization. I did notice as I was reading those are not the mentions of human rights. What I've tried to do in this organizing for today is sort of condense, and I don't think I actually end up getting to the interview narratives where the rights are explicitly mentioned. So, but there are mentions of those rights which seem to be significant. A lot of talk about these services being guaranteed, and also that they're guaranteed to everybody on the same terms and conditions. Pregnant women in Cuba receive preferential treatment and enjoy the benefits of elevated social status. All women receive maternity leave benefits for a full year, and there are now parental leave provisions for fathers. Preferential treatment is given to pregnant women in virtually all areas of public life. They're given preferred seating on buses, can move to the front of any line for public services, and perhaps most significantly, are given increased rations for food and vitamins. Participant CC2 explains that when she was pregnant, they gave me a dietary certificate for food, which consisted of a ½ pound of meat and milk. In addition, CC9 states that doctors give a lot of attention to everyone, but especially to pregnant women. This special attention might help to explain the willingness of women to conform to a compulsory care regimen. Pregnant women are required to receive prenatal care, which includes training on how to care for children. It regularly includes internment in hogares maternos, maternal homes, if complications arise during pregnancy and the medical team deems that it will reduce risk for a woman to be relocated. So this is a front of one of these maternal homes. As in all healthcare facilities in Cuba, the nurses appear to be dressed in a nurse costume. She doesn't have the thing on her head, but often they do, so they take this role seriously, and it's sort of performed in a traditional way. And this would be the inside of a maternal home, and so not to put too fine a point on it, but I perhaps it's necessary to say explicitly that if complications are detected in a pregnancy, women are sent sometimes quite far away, depending on how close they live to this hogar materno, and are required to stay there for as long as the doctor says they have to stay there. That's it. They're also required to go to routine, it changes depending on how far along they are in the pregnancy, routine checkups, and they are compelled, so if they miss one, people go looking for them and make sure that they get there eventually. Women may not opt out of these programs and cannot make other arrangements. Compliance is enforced by the state. We can talk later about how these requirements are enforced. Among the 27 participants in this research study, 6 reported spending part of their pregnancy in a hogar materno. When a woman is ready to give birth, she's admitted to the regional maternity hospital. At 13 to 14 weeks of pregnancy, women are required to receive training from their medical team concerning how to ensure a healthy pregnancy and how to raise and educate their child. There are numerous mandatory medical tests as well that are administered throughout the pregnancy to the mother. Many are also required for the biological father. These tests include blood tests, which includes a mandatory HIV test, ultrasounds, routine blood pressure and weight checks, urine analysis, measurement of the growing belly, and genetic screening. None of the participants expressed any objection to the mandatory nature of the training or medical testing. All seem to accept that these were benefits of the health system and essential for ensuring healthy pregnancy and delivery. As will be explained, criticism was reserved for lack of economic or other types of support after the birth of the child. Inconsistencies in access to medical care, which included differential access for women who were able to buy gifts for their doctors and those who could not, as well as a difficulty in accessing consistent care from the same doctor or even qualified doctors, as many have left the country to practice abroad in medical diplomatic missions, and lack of pain medication for normal births and poor conditions in maternity hospitals. So some of the things that I've just mentioned here I'll have time to get to in a little greater detail, but some of them I won't. So I'll just say that the two main trends in these 27 narratives were that women wish they could have pain medication for normal or vaginal birth. They're not given any. And they wish that they could see the same doctor throughout their entire pregnancy, something that is mentioned in other research sites as well. It seems to be fairly universal. And this was particularly a particularly significant problem in Cuba because a lot of women complain that they have a good doctor or there are good doctors, or Cuba takes a lot of pride in its medical system. If only the doctors were in Cuba and not somewhere else. Current estimates are that there are about 37,000 Cuban medical, we'll use the term doctors, but these also include paramedics and other practitioners that are on medical diplomatic missions abroad in about 28 different countries. Recently, Cuba deployed 165 medical doctors to West Africa to help with the Ebola crisis. So women have this, sometimes it appeared, I think it only appeared in one narrative, but being in the communities and talking to women in Cuba, this is a current that is running throughout the conversations all the time. So there's a lot of concern about that. Women are clear and direct about their lack of choice, even if this is itself not a point of resistance. So women don't think that things are something that they're not. They don't think that they have choices. They're not fooled. So again, it's not the model of the socialist dupe. It's just not a point of resistance. There's no confusion about the uniformity of healthcare in the country, and most view this as a benefit of Cuban citizenship. CC2 declares that there's only one health system in Cuba. We're not able to choose. Further, it is clear that the patient, it is the patient that has to adjust to the location and range of services. CC11 states that we don't decide which services, we adjust ourselves to what is provided in the hospital. Some explain that the mandatory state-run system is beneficial and generates positive birth outcomes and equality. Others are resentful not because they would prefer a different provider, but because lack of choice means poor quality of service and/or it replicates other aspects of life in the country. Thus, the narratives reveal different degrees of acceptance of governmental and medical authority. For example, participant DC1 explains that all women are guaranteed equal medical services without exception. These are high-risk cases where there is more medical attention during the birth and afterward, and more systematic care between appointments. Medical care is distributed equally according to DC1, with only the exception of high-risk pregnancies that require more medical attention. Both DC1 and DC2 describe medical services as guaranteed, indicating the citizenship rights mentioned above. DC2 remarks that medical services are guaranteed from the medical point of view. This comment and others also highlight the prominence of medical authority in the health system. DC4 confirms that women do not have access to preferred services, but to services that correspond with their medical needs. Women receive the service that they need, not that they prefer. In the province that I live in, the pregnancy is followed in the woman's own community, but there's only one maternity hospital in the region, and all births take place in the same hospital equally, although there is differentiation among patients according to their condition. The most direct and unequivocal conclusion is drawn by CC18, who declares that pregnant women in this country can't prefer anything, not whether to have a C-section or a ligature, not whether to spend the postpartum period in hospital, because they send you right home. There's only one thing that I can say: it is not possible to decide. And in the written narrative, this was underlined several times. This woman had a bit of an edge. And often in the narrative, you had to kind of look for that, because there were consistent markers, and while women were told that this would be anonymous, it's only, they're only so convinced of that, they didn't include their name. There were a lot of references to El Triunfo de la Revolución, which is part of the language, part of the national conversation, so it appears everywhere. But yeah, that woman she had some interesting critical insights. The benefits of systematic uniform medical care for pregnancy and childbirth is expressed consistently, although CC1 equivocates. To choose among types of care is impossible in this country. We have to conform ourselves to the type of medical care that our government provides, which is not bad, it is good. But it can improve as we have potential and equipment that is not exploited. In this country, we do not have preferred services. We have to adjust to the available medical services, which in Cuba are free, and for this reason, we do not demand more than we are given. Others attribute their own health and survival to the health system. For example, CC12 notes that we do not count on desired services as we have no choice. We have to accept the services provided by the government, and in my particular case, I am grateful to this service. If I had not been attended in a hospital, my story would have been different, and my son and I would have died in childbirth. So I explained throughout this chapter that the concept of risk, which comes up in narratives in Canada and the United States and everywhere else I've done this sort of research, seems to be ideational. There's this idea of risk. We know that risk exists if precautions aren't taken, if the birth doesn't go well. But women in Cuba, as with women in other developing countries, have experienced this risk. So it's no longer just an idea that things could go wrong. They have seen births go wrong, and they know what happens when people aren't able to access those services. So they're comparing their own situation and an imagined or ideal set of circumstances to a very different kind of reality. These statements reflect a very pragmatic approach to assessing and analyzing childbirth options, or lack thereof. Margaret Locke and Patricia Coffert have documented this trend in widely divergent societies. Their research revealed the complexity of women's responses to the process of medicalization, responses which may range from selective resistance to selective compliance, although women may also be indifferent. However, that ambivalence, coupled with pragmatism, may be the dominant mode of response to medicalization by women. This slide for me, apparently it comes from a Cuban hospital, I don't know exactly where, represents the aversion that many women, especially privileged North American women, have to the medical model for pregnancy and childbirth. There's a woman, and we don't know what the circumstances are here, but she looks very helpless. It's a very clinical kind of setting. Everybody's in blue and gloves. There are a lot of medical personnel in here. Looks like many of them are observing. But the sense that the experience of this event is completely determined by medical protocols, by medical authorities, regulated as a medical experience, is something that has garnered a lot of resistance in Canada and the United States, and likely other countries and other contexts as well. Cuban women, as I have been explaining, don't see a problem with the model, with the way that it is actualized and the way that they experience it, yes. But this does not cause them the same kind of consternation that it causes privileged North American women. I'll say a little bit about the questions concerning midwives, and then I can return to that later if that's something that people are particularly interested in hearing more about. But when asked about alternative models, about midwives as alternatives to medical practitioners, women that were included in the study and women that I've spoken to over the last number of years in Cuba really don't understand the question, or they don't understand why anybody would prefer that over a gynecologist or a medical doctor, and they don't know why it would be better to, what is in their mind, go back to an antiquated way of doing things. So in response to the question about midwifery, women told stories about these births that did not go well for their mother or for the grandmother or for an aunt, and sometimes well, I guess it would be the case that in Cuba this would be prior to the revolution, so in fairly recent memory for most people that were interviewed, people who had brothers or sisters that were lost at birth when their own mothers had births that didn't go well. So this was kind of a non-starter. It was hard to explain to Cuban women why some women would prefer this approach, why some women would rather be attended by a midwife, why there would be any kind of benefits. It was really just a non-starter for the reasons that I have indicated. They're also well aware that care provided by midwives, and in their minds these are unskilled, untrained midwives, the trusted woman in the community that has the most experience in delivering babies, that this is a model of practice that is quite common in a lot of other developing countries, and the idea of choosing that when you can have what they have, which is a better experience of maternal health and maternal survival, seems nonsensical. It also goes to the idea of the nation and national identity, that they're proud. They know that women in Guatemala die in childbirth on a regular basis. They know that they don't all get to go to the regional maternity hospital, and they are quite happy with that. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get off that slide. Oh, so this is a sort of traditional image of community parteras. While a majority, 14 of the 27, a slim majority, stated that health services were officially free of charge for all Cubans, 4 of whom had also described the services as free. So we have the same women talking about the health services being great because they're free, also explained that services are much better for women who have personal connections to medical doctors or could provide gifts for their doctors or pay for services. These gifts and payments are not consistent, of course, with the overall goals and commitments of the system, but have become a reality in all areas. Connections, gifts, or payments will ensure continuity of care, high quality of care, better access to scarce medications, and can secure a cesarean section if a woman prefers it. So in some cases, the payment to the doctor will motivate them to provide care that they are able to provide. In other cases, Cubans living in Cuba will need to find, through connections in the exterior, medical supplies and have them brought to Cuba so that the doctors can use them. So for example, I know of a family who required some major dental work, but the dentist in Cuba didn't have access to the tools or the stuff for the fillings or whatever. So there's, in my mind, sort of this watched this person go on the person who was living in Canada, this kind of ludicrous search from dentist's office to dentist's office trying to procure supplies to take to Cuba, which I don't know how common that is in Guelph. Probably in a place like Miami, there are, or bigger urban centers, there's much more of a network for this. So in some cases, this is the way things have to be negotiated. So needless to say, if somebody doesn't have access to these contacts in the exterior or the money to try to secure them in Cuba, they are going to be disadvantaged. CC1 explains that I received good care at the hospital because I had my brother-in-law with me, who was a doctor, and those who worked there were his colleagues. The importance of the ability to buy gifts to give to medical staff is identified by CC4. Here, in order to obtain priority service, pregnant women who have the means will give good gifts to their doctors or invite them to eat at their home, and in return they will receive good care. In this way, one can receive preferential treatment. CC18 is more critical in her assessment, which is that many doctors are motivated by that which their patients bring them, or provide better service for their good friends. Similarly, CC19 is critical of the degree to which medical practitioners have been corrupted, leaving few options for women who have neither connections nor means of payment. Every day, doctors and other medical personnel become more corrupt, this is the quote, such that if you don't go with gifts, you will not receive good care. Participant DC2 explains that with personal connections, it's possible for women to arrange for elective cesarean sections. If you can make arrangements in advance with a doctor friend, for aesthetic reasons, it's possible to have this type of birth. In the case of DC6, she needed to save 25 convertible pesos, approximately $30 US, to pay for a needed C-section. In cases where a C-section is believed to be necessary, but normal labor is possible, women will be left to labor for at least 24 hours. The desire to avoid this painful period pre-surgery is understandable. This participant says, I had to save to be able to pay the 25 convertible pesos that the doctor who did my C-section asked for, because in my case, it could not be a normal birth. Participant DC3, a practicing nurse, explains in greater detail that we are living in a stage in medicine where if one has a friend who is a doctor or nurse or someone within the system, they are guaranteed better attention at least. Some people don't know anyone. As we say, they have neither cat nor dog. So although they will receive health services, they will not have the best care, or the decisions are not what they really should be. There are many mothers who can spend up to 3 days in labor suffering along with the baby, which could be avoided with good medical attention. But the most serious economic issues, according to the participants, present themselves after the baby is born. The difficulties that one might experience during childbirth are serious and noteworthy, but they're temporary and relatively unimportant in comparison with the economic barriers that exist to creating a family and raising a child. So many women that I spoke with about the research said, who cares? As long as everybody gets through the birth alive, we're good with that. The problems start once you go home from the hospital. Then life is tough. So for many Cuban women, it seemed to be kind of this indulgent North American fantasy that should we give birth with the medical doctor in attendance or the midwife? Should the lights be dimmed? Should they be wearing the medical scrubs or something else? What kind of music is playing in the background? And I don't mean to trivialize these, because these are important dimensions of an overall experience. That is the focus of a lot of debate. But for Cuban women, this is nonsense. And a lot of them said, look, what happens after, that's a tough part. Doesn't matter. We get home from the hospital alive, then the trouble begins. The difficulties that one might experience during childbirth are serious and noteworthy, but they're temporary and relatively unimportant in comparison with the economic barriers that exist to creating a family and raising a child. It's difficult to locate all of which might be necessary for a baby, such as diapers, a crib, clothing, milk. Some items are prohibitively expensive for some people, and other items are simply not available. This stress is revealed in the narrative of CC4. The reality is that children are in need after they are born. And for this reason, many women decide not to have children, even though maternity leave is guaranteed for women, but they're not guaranteed what they need. So at this, I'm skipping over huge sections of really interesting stuff, so it's painful for me. I want to tell you everything, but I know that I can't. This is connected, this question about whether or not women decide to have children in the first place is connected to sort of abortion politics in Cuba. Cuba has very, very high rates of abortion, which is legal and quite easy to attain. It doesn't seem to be stigmatized. I've had people many times in social situations say, Candace, have you had abortions? I'm like, what? You can't say that. You can't ask somebody that. But it's another part of daily life. It's something that's difficult. Everyone faces similar difficult situations. There are times when that's the best decision in a lot of difficult circumstances. So I've addressed this in the chapter as well, but I'm going to skip over that now. There are also, and I don't think I'm going to get to this, but I would just like to flag it because I think it's significant. When I talked about the problems of women, or which would be the problem of all Cubans, finding money so that they can pay doctors for services or can buy much needed supplies, there's a racial element to this as well. So while it's very important to Cuban national identity that racism was a thing of the bourgeois colonial period and we don't have it today, there are at least some cracks in this nice picture of socialist paradise as it affects race. And to make a long story very short, most Cubans that are able, through connections in the exterior or because they work in the tourism industry in Cuba, the most Cubans that have good access to those foreign sources tend to be much whiter, much lighter skinned than Cubans that don't have those connections. But that's a whole other discussion, and there are others, people like Suhatha Fernandez, who have written on this, and that's another piece. If Cuban women then are compliant or selectively compliant, what does this mean? It certainly does not mean uncritical acceptance of what they're provided, and it does not indicate lack of information or familiarity with other possibilities, as most Cubans have family and friends in other countries and are well aware of the choices that are available elsewhere. The overwhelming acceptance of state and medical authority is perhaps best understood in terms of Cuba's unique position as a poorer developing country with highly developed health and other social indicators. Cuban women compare their circumstances against those of women in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Guatemala, and Venezuela. They know that in those countries and many others, some women have access to advanced medical care, and others can only rely on help from friends, family, and unskilled midwives. They also know that this difference results in more morbidity and mortality for the latter, and do not take this fact for granted. It's also the case that while medical and state authority are virtually inseparable, they are understood and critiqued as separate yet interlocking systems. Some women were critical of medical doctors' willingness to provide care based on patients' abilities to provide gifts or payment, while others explained that this was a problem attributable not to individual medical doctors, but to the economic and political conditions of the country, which were the responsibility of the government. The Cuban women who contributed narratives tended to be more concerned about the conditions for raising children rather than for birthing them. The transition to motherhood was likely to be difficult and stressful, but not more so than what was to come. The real challenge for families is their mere existence, which eclipses any fanciful meanings of more comfortable or agentive ways of giving birth. Something else that came up in the narratives was when women were asked about ideal conditions or for giving birth, or the ideal way for giving birth. As I mentioned, they said, well, the difficulties start afterward. What would really be great is to have good conditions to raise kids, and that included conditions for having essentially a nuclear family. So there were a lot of discussions or a lot of threads of conversation related to this, which might appear when you read through them to be quite sort of morally conservative. We need conditions so that the mother and the father can be together in the home and raising the kids and giving them a good upbringing. But it's a whole other discussion here that relates to the inability of a lot of couples to live together independently, independent from extended family, and to have some bit of privacy to try to carve out a family as they understand it. So a lot of complications in living conditions as well after babies are born. Okay, I'm going to conclude then, and then take questions. Position between developing and developed worlds, Cuba achieves first world levels of population health through undemocratic and illiberal means. The paradox is that the coercive nature of maternal health and reproductive health policy accounts for the country's exceptional health indicators. Tendencies in the literature and popular media to either fully praise Cuba for its results or demonize it for its means are wrong-headed. The complexity of this paradox might be lost on a more ideologically predisposed international audience, but it is not lost on most Cubans. This is demonstrated in the narratives presented in this talk. Participants distinguished the good from the bad in their experiences with state health policy and provision, and indicated the dual lenses through which the health system should be understood: global structural and domestic political. They were also attentive to the instances in which their own goals and the goals of their family coincided with the goals of the regime, and when they diverged or when their goals were undermined by political objectives. Overall, the most serious line of analysis and critique concerned the growing socioeconomic inequality that determined not only quality of experience but actual outcome. Of all the women in my comparative study, Cuban women are by far the most medicalized, but the least critical of their medicalization. Yet compliance with medical protocols does not seem to indicate either false consciousness or powerlessness. Women in Cuba understand their system and its limitations and do not believe that an alternate health system for pregnancy and childbirth would be in their interests. Of course, they would be effectively powerless to suggest or make system-level changes, but this powerlessness coincides with their preferences and assessments. It does not explain them. Access to medical care is understood to be a human right, one that is, fortunately, respected by their government. Fulfillment of this right in practice, however, is frequently compromised, which, as explained, draws much criticism. Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. Fantastic. I'm sure there are lots of questions about it. Do you want to take them or should I?
Yeah, I can handle it. Yeah.
You can handle it.
I can handle it.
Good.
I just have a question regarding the special period, which I know is a huge part of the history.
Yeah.
What do we know about the maternal experience prior to the special period and during? And how has that really affected this whole process? I guess another question would be, do you think that a lot of the corruption that you're talking about is associated with the special
period? Yes, absolutely. Let me address the first part, and then if I forget the second part, you're going to have to remind me. So before the special period, women talk about, and all Cubans talk about, things being very, very different. So once the special period began, about 1990, after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was difficult to find food to eat. People had to invent things. I know people who lived in the countryside who talk about making yogurt from the cows in the community so that they could sell and get some money to buy food. There was no soap in the stores. There was nothing. So prior to that, things were quite good. So women that I've spoken with that had any access or any interaction with the medical system or who had babies prior to the special period, let's say throughout the 1980s, when they went to the hospital, there were sheets on the bed, and there were diapers stacked up for the baby after the birth, and there were conditions, as Cubans refer to them. During the special period, that all disappeared, and it certainly hasn't come back. Things I mentioned that the economy, by most objective reports, has I don't know if bounced back is correct. It's improved. So GDP has doubled since about the year 2000. But the women that I have spoken with have not seen any evidence of this in any of the regional maternity hospitals. So they're still bringing a bucket. They talked about the indignity of this. So it's not just a big inconvenience, but having to, imagine being in labor and having to remember to take the bucket and the calentador so that they could get the water, plug it into the wall, and heat their own water. And as well bring the sheets for the bed, and in some cases gloves for the medical doctors if they could acquire them. So yes, the special period has definitely had an impact. And I think I was going to say, in relation to the second part of your question, it's not just I guess the corruption of professional medical doctors would have to do with financial need, but also some differences in the way that the economy was structured after Castro, throughout the latter part of the 1990s, said, we're going to have to do what we never thought we would have to do, and that's make concessions. So there were some elements of a more market-type economy that were introduced in Cuba, which allowed people to start getting a little bit more, or a lot more, relative to people that couldn't access anything. So the creation of paladares, where people were able to turn their homes into restaurants and could serve tourists. This was sort of a huge development and started this period of increasing inequality. So there is definitely a connection to the special period, and I wouldn't expect that if things continue to improve, if the economy continues to improve in Cuba, that there will be any noticeable difference in the hospitals, but we'll see. You can decide who's next. I'm not going to.
Well, she's a very nice person. She just lets me go.
Okay.
I'll just use that nicely. Thanks, Candace. I was particularly interested in the part how basically dominant conceptions of the Cuban national identity influence this interaction with the healthcare system. And I was just wondering, also from the comparison with the other cases that you look at in the book, do you get the sense that the effect of the effect of nationalism on the extent to which patients are willing to go along with whatever, is that contingent on exactly how well the system seems to be working? Would the Cubans be equally willing to reproduce this national narrative if they wouldn't be able to? I mean, it's almost answering the question, but I'm particularly interested in the comparison with the United States, for example. Are you going to see nationalist rhetoric there as well, even though the system doesn't work, or how should I understand this?
Well, the answer to the first part of the question, would Cubans continue to buy into it if it didn't serve that nationalistic purpose? So if the indicators start to...
if it doesn't achieve the good results.
Right. Yeah, so, probably not. What they would do about it is a whole other question. So if you're saying if infant mortality rates started to rise, and if there were more maternal deaths, and if the outcomes were worse, yes, there would probably be more dissatisfaction. How that would be expressed, I don't know.
No, it's just more of the theoretical point.
Yeah.
That the relationship between national identity and whatever client interaction with whatever type of social services apparently is influenced in important degrees by the way that system is functioning. I just thought that was something.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. It's making me think of something else interesting, which I think you're sort of asking, but it's sort of so new in my head, I don't know how it's going to come out. But with your question about the United States, I'd have to sort of think back into the files of that research, which is completely different. I did research in southern Texas along the U.S.-Mexico border in the Rio Grande region with women primarily of Mexican origin. But what's interesting there is that I don't think it would be a national, I don't think we could call it nationalistic, but there's a certain amount of acceptance of the system for very different reasons, a certain amount of compliance, even though there's objective evidence, I would say, that the system doesn't serve their interests at all. So the two don't have to fit together, it seems. So there are the narratives that come from the lower Rio Grande Valley in Texas of Mexican women going through a long process of labor and all of a sudden being told by the obstetrician, you have to have a cesarean section. No explanation. They said, I don't really know what happened. But you know, 1 minute everything was going well, and the next minute I was in the operating room, and I'm not going to say they seemed fine with that, but they're also comparing their experiences to what they had experienced in Mexico, or what they would have had access to in Mexico, which was nothing, basically. And they're also things that came up in those narratives about women being offered a special offer of sterilization for only $300 or $400 cash at the end of their hospital stay, which is in many cases paid for by the government, and it's a very limited kind of parcel of benefits, and feeling pressured to make a decision and going ahead with it and thinking that it's actually a really good offer. So while for me, and I'm assuming for lots of other people as well, there'd be some big ethical questions about, dubious informed consent and so on. But so it might be, what I guess I'm trying to say is that I agree that with this suggestion that interests don't have to align or be served by a system that's accepted or that women go along with. There was something else I was going to say, but I don't remember what it was now. But yeah. So there's that. Leah?
Thanks, Candace. That was really interesting, and I have two related questions. The first one, so I was interested in your reference to sort of some of the variations, partly around access to resources or socioeconomics, and then a passing comment around sort of potential differences around race. I was just curious generally about any other, social identity indicators that might have played out in any kind of different ways, if that information was available in your interview. So particularly, I'm thinking about age, and the reason that and this sort of related question is because I'm curious about, sort of given my relationship with young mothers as part of sort of some of the work that I've done before, I'm curious about how much of a gradation there is in, say, the Canadian context around the relationship between the idea of choice in the system and the medical profession's determination of your capacity to deal with the choice. Right. So how much choice there really is, depending on who we're talking about in this sort of Western context, and then whether or not there were this mapped onto the Cuban context in any way.
Yeah, really good question. I included in the interviews would be women with a very wide range of ages, but I'm not aware of any differences according to age, although they might be there, but I don't know. I think that's that's a good question, because there would be different experiences at different points in the life cycle. But yeah, I didn't find any evidence of that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Candace. I have two questions. First has to do with the issue of compliance. When you kind of engage them, I'd like to know how is this monitored? How is the market? So afterwards, what happens? The follow-up, especially when the follow-up is not out here, because the mentality aspect perceive it as something that is being monitored because of its own integrity, or just something in their own interest. That's the first question. The second question has to do with more international aspects, which you also mentioned that for the women, Cuban doctors being abroad, we can make use of the doctors at home, but why are they doing abroad? And again, thinking that to the role of the state, if the state continuously doing this, the state continuously sending people abroad, one, of course, to continue again internationally, but two, of course, it's a way of the Cuban state stamping its authority on the international scene that we cannot be competitive with. The reason I say this is because Cuba, as you rightly mentioned, said 165 medical personnel to Nigerians alone. The US responded to 3,000 military men, and it's been highly denied that might be an attempt to dilute Cuban effect. So in that context, where does that narrative stand? How do the union perceive it, and how does that really?
So the second question about the interests of the, is it about the interests of the state in sending people abroad? I think it is, I guess, part of the revolutionary commitment to be, well, a few years after the success of the revolution, it declared itself to be socialist and international socialist in character. So this is quite consistent with the way that it has functioned from pretty much the beginning. And it is important, according to the Cuban government, to be in solidarity with people suffering wherever they are in the world. A few years ago, I don't remember what year it was now. So 2010, Hurricane Katrina. It was, sort of an international, not necessarily an incident, but Cuba offered to send medical doctors to New Orleans, and they were refused by the American government quite predictably. So it is this belief that they can help, and they have commitments not just to sending their own doctors abroad, but bringing medical students from all over the world to the medical school in Cuba and training them for free, and as an obligation after receiving that medical training to go back and work in underserviced or impoverished areas in their own countries. So I think that there does seem to be something genuine to this pattern, but it's also a matter of nationalism and national pride that Cuba is doing this. So there's a big symbolic benefit that it receives, whether it's diluted by the United States sending 3,000. I haven't seen the back and forth on this. I'm sure that Cuba would say, well, we're a country that's like this big, and the United States is, 330 or more million people, and a very wealthy country. It can afford, why isn't it sending more than that? So I think that Cuba would be able to hold its own in that rhetorical argument that it is, and it gets a lot of mileage out of this, being a very poor country, a small country, one that has been marginalized, to say the least, by the embargo, but still manages to maintain the health of its own population and send people abroad. So it's incredibly important. What was the first question? About compliance. I think it's a second thing that you mentioned, that women think that it serves their interests. I don't think they're fooled that Well, they also know that they're under surveillance, but they're not just under surveillance because they need to go to the prenatal appointments or because they need to get to the doctor, or they're not under surveillance. And I think that this is a point I don't know if I made strongly enough in the talk. This is not an isolated part of life in Cuba, being pregnant and going to all the appointments, maybe being interned in a maternal home, making sure that they go through the training for raising the kids and all of this. All of life in Cuba is under surveillance all the time for a variety of different things. So that's what there is a system of neighborhood committees that watch to see what's going on in the neighborhood, and there are sort of block captains. They would be, I'm not sure what it's the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, and they're someone in charge of that on every block, basically. And the Federation of Cuban Women also have a neighborhood kind of network configuration and will encourage people to get to their appointments. What happens if they don't go? Well, lack of compliance can result in any number of consequences, and it could result in it's probably not going to result in them going to jail, but there are a number of other things that could make life very difficult for people in the community. So there are times when the government will distribute refrigerators to everybody in the community, or rice cookers or pressure cookers. So these are things that are expensive and hard to acquire. And if there's a distribution of these, sometimes there's a nominal cost. This is a huge benefit. If somebody hasn't been following the rules, they might miss out on various distributions of things. So there are subtle ways, and it's not kind of an all or nothing, but there are ways to make sure that people will follow the rules. Sally.
I know I need to go and buy the book, so but I'm going to ask you anyway. I mean, this picture for me, coming from the position of Honduras, seems normal, that women would aspire to have the kinds of conditions that are available in Cuba. But this is not very surprising. But in comparison, I mean, did you find this? And I'm assuming this. I mean, this is what I know from the people in Honduras. I mean, they just can't afford to go to doctors. They want to go, and I've seen in one particular case, and I'm quite familiar with, the woman actually died in childbirth because the husband couldn't afford to take her down, and then he ran off because he knew he'd be in trouble, and there were 5 other kids that were left without either parent. Because people aspire precisely to this. Did you find that?
Yes, the case of Honduras was completely different again, and I did interviews in 4 different communities in Copan, which is one of the communities that has the highest rates of maternal mortality. And there were, yes, women said in their narratives they aspired to it, but I wasn't sure, I wasn't confident at the end of the whole exercise whether, I had partnered with the Red Cross that had an intervention plan in the area, whether they were giving us the responses that they thought we wanted to hear. There had been a lot of training. You need to make a birth plan, you need to save up a little bit of money, you need to do this, you need to, watch for these warning signs and so on. So they seemed to be able to say that when you asked about the ideal, but in thinking in 2 communities in particular, that ideal didn't match up at all. So they thought the ideal would be to get not to the hospital, depending on where they were, because that could be a difficult proposition, but to get to the birthing clinic. But then in many cases, there appeared to be no real attempt made to get there, and figuring out why that was. Sometimes, and most often, it was resources, just too difficult. No car, no money. There's also security risks. So the Red Cross had been encouraging people to go for prenatal checkups, and they'd have to walk down the mountain to go to the little health clinic, and the women would go, and it didn't take too long for the thieves and gang members in the area to figure out that they're going down, and they have a little bit of money to be able to pay for the appointment, and so they're robbed on the way. So Honduras is really complex, even in kind of the simplistic elements of the difficulties of accessing services. Even when some of those barriers can be removed, it's almost as though others kind of rush in. But that was expressed by the overwhelming number of women. There were some women who, in some of the communities, who said that the midwife would be ideal. So there was there was more variation, but the medical service was still by far recognized as the best way to go. Craig?
I know Teresa's got her hand up too. I'm going to try and ask you a political theory question.
All right. I'm going to try to answer it.
Well, I'm sure you can. Whether I can ask it, I'm not so sure. I'm kind of struck by the tension that you're describing between the lack of agency that these women are facing in their childbirth decisions on the one hand, and then the creation of life opportunity that's being kind of, provided for them in this context. And in some ways, what you're describing is a real development success story. You laid out the comparative data in Cuba is by far and away leaps and bounds ahead of most developing countries in the United States. But on the other hand, they're obviously very constrained and forced to go to interned childbirth facilities if there's any sign of risk. And as a political theorist, I'm interested in how you would interpret this contradiction. I don't know if you used them in your work, but I'm reminded a little bit of the work of Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, because it seems like there's a tension between the freedom to choose, the basic right to choose and decide where you're going to give birth, how are you going to give birth, versus the capability to function. And it's a very stark one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm going to do my best to answer it. I have done some reading of the capabilities approach, and as far as I understand it, the goal is to achieve a state where there is a real choice to be made. So that establishing capabilities, I know this is part of the critique as well, that it kind of ends up being this sort of neoliberal, well, here are the choices, and as an individual, you can choose to go to the birthing clinic or stay home as long as there is a real option there. Then that's sort of as far as the obligation of the theory or of the state or whatever. In Cuba, this doesn't exist. There is absolutely no choice. So I don't know whether it would fit any of the criteria of that model. For the work that I had been doing, I relied heavily here on, I guess, what would I say? Work from anthropology that looks very specifically at the relationship between structure and agency, and tends to, and the contributors, people like Browner and Abel, Raina Rapp, tend to think that we shouldn't over-determine structure, or think that if the structures are oppressive and tend to channel certain results, that there's no agency, that is sort of problematic. And so there's a lot of really interesting work done in a lot of areas related to pregnancy and childbirth. Raina Rapp has this really wonderful study on the history of amniocentesis and making choices about genetic testing and selective abortion and so on, and the way that women exercise agency within pretty serious confines and serious constraints. So that's where I, in the book, tended to focus my sort of theoretical energies. And I see it, and hopefully represented it that way today, that there is agency even if it doesn't look like there's resistance or demand for alternatives. There are sort of maybe choices that women make in other parts of their lives that are compensatory for their inability to choose here. But I would say that the decision that the system, going along with the system, serves their interests, whether it's because they fear political reprisals or they think it's going to achieve the best outcome and then they can get on with dealing with the real problems of life, I think that is something that they have calculated and decided on their own. So I don't know if that answers your question about agency, but that relationship between agency and structure is something that I've thought about a lot in all of the cases, and that comes up. It comes up in all of the cases, but especially the work that I was talking about with the women of Mexican origin in Texas, because there are some severe constraints, not a state-run medical system as in Cuba, but there, very constraining system of insurance schemes that channel women into very narrow patterns of access to service. I don't know if there are even decisions there, but even within that, women try to figure out how they can exercise some agency or make some decisions. Whether is that good enough? Well, I think that's another question that I've avoided answering entirely. But that's sort of the way I understand agency in that case. Teresa? Teresa?
Thank you very much for an interesting talk, and I asked a question without having read the book, so I have to confess that. I just wonder if you could help me and whoever may share my thinking, how to put this in its context, in the sense that I want to sort of go at this from a slightly different feminist angle, if I may. So if we set aside the issue of whether or not a maternal health childbirth order should be radicalized, and this is a given in Cuba. Do you know if there any evidence to suggest that women really have been singled out as a group for this nationalistic discourse on health? So I'm thinking, as partly I'm thinking, maternal health, infant mortality rate in a closed system such as this, I would venture to guess that it's a relatively achievable and concrete goal, that you can show people the result in a relatively easy way. Whereas at this other health indicators would be a lot trickier. So I'm thinking, for example, that say for a severely sick person with cancer patients, do you know whether they have any options in terms of their choice of treatment, or that really that this too is highly monitored? So back to then, the question then is, a pregnant woman really isolated as a targeted group for control because, like I said, it's a highly deliverable goal for nationalistic purpose.
Yeah, that's a good question. It does serve that nationalistic purpose. It's very sort of visible part of the life cycle, going through that experience of pregnancy and birth. And then there are those indicators, do people survive and what's the morbidity and so on. I don't know in terms of surveillance and monitoring for other conditions. I think that there would be. So I know of people who have had high blood pressure and so on, and like the people from the consultorios, the neighborhood doctor and nurse teams come to find them, and they do their blood pressure in the house and so on. So it does extend to other conditions. It extends to men. Cancer, I don't know. They would have very high levels of cancer services available, like top services available in Havana. Hugo Chavez went to Cuba to receive cancer treatment. But that would definitely there would to be different services available to people with different abilities to pay. So that's not anything that's advertised. There's also there are medical tourist services that Cuba markets abroad. But within the country, there would be, I don't know how much surveillance there would be for somebody that's going through cancer treatment. I assume that it would be, especially at a community level, that surveillance would obtain. If somebody had to receive treatment, chemotherapy, or radiation or something, they'd have to be, I don't know if they'd have to be in a major center, might have to go to the capital which would bring other kinds of challenges, and would be much easier for people that had some means and some contacts in the exterior.
So, sorry, this is my exact point. So you said that is not national health care? That
Sorry, say that again?
For treatment for major illness is not covered?
It is covered.
Right.
It is covered.
Okay. So the other things that you mentioned, of course, that come into play, as you said, your ability to give gifts to
Yes.
doctors and all that. All right, that's...
Well, I guess there's a formal system and the informal system. And the
Right.
formal system says people get what they, it's an old communist line that you receive according to need, right?
Right, yeah.
So if somebody needs cancer treatment, they will receive it. But it's hard, but there's always a gray zone, right? With any kind of treatment. How much treatment? Where are they going?
That's my question. Then.
Yes,
So
and that will
then once you are declared a sick person,
Yes.
then do you have any options, or that everything is set for you in the same way a pregnant woman is set? That this is our plan, and you have no rest of
It would function in the same way, and as with pregnant women, if you have the ability to buy your way into a better level of service, then you can do that. So it would be the same.
Candace, thank you for reminding me about the shelter. It was great. I have a question about your cases in the book, Canada, the U.S., Honduras, and Cuba. Are you implicitly sort of ranking the best country with the best policy, and how do you avoid sort of doing that? Because those are very interesting and unusual cases to compare.
No, there's no attempt to rank them. The question, of course, there ended up being multiple overlapping questions that all ended up in a tangled web. But I think one of the original questions was basically why does it appear to be the case that women that are affluent women of North America who are sort of at least at risk for the negative effects of medicalization, why are they the most critical of that medicalization? So it was an attempt to answer that question more on a philosophical level than to figure out who's doing the best in terms of maternal health policy. That ends up being part of the story. But the early writings on medicalization, of course, focused on things like eugenics movements and surveillance that was directed at disadvantaged, meaning low socioeconomic and racialized populations. Over time, it appears that those populations that would probably count as socioeconomically disadvantaged and racialized are not as critical of medicalization as affluent white women who want a different kind of birth experience in Canada and the United States. So it seems to be a curious direction, and that's what I was exploring, and that's why I was exploring North and South, because as I traveled and did research in other areas in Central America and in Cuba, I realized that the kinds of concerns and conversations were completely different on the same issues, and global health protocols are pretty much standardized. So which is not totally uncontroversial, but for the most part, if we want to know what it will take to make sure that very few women or no women die during pregnancy and childbirth or in the postpartum period, there are a clear number of steps that need to be followed. There's not really much variation. Yet there's a lot of variation in how women talk about birthing experiences and what sorts of things are valued, critiqued, resisted, and so on. So these are the kinds of questions that drove the research, and definitely not an attempt to say they're doing well here and not so well there. And even in the North American countries, the well-developed, highly industrialized countries, I included what I did refer somewhat uncomfortably to relatively privileged and relatively marginalized women. So in Canada, I interviewed women from the immigrant community, so women from 28 different countries, many of whom had had children in other countries, and in Canada, and in the United States there were interviews done with. Also, this is all challenging to separate out because I'm going to say American-born women and relatively recent women of Mexican origin, but some of those women in the second category were actually born in the United States, and some of the women who were in the kind of affluent American-born of a certain socioeconomic standing were born in Mexico. So it's not, these are not all clean, and I have in my chapters the proper sort of, I'm using this term, I'm referring to immigrant and disadvantaged in this way, although it really doesn't capture all of what's going on in those populations.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Really,
Thanks, Sally.
good question.